Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and here at Bruegel, we are undergoing a research project on the future of work and inclusive growth in Europe. The project analyzes the impact of technology on the nature, quantity, and quality of work, welfare systems, and inclusive growth at large. And The Sound of Economics is proud to contribute to the project with a space for discussion and analysis on these themes. Today, we are going to discuss about how digital platforms are overtaking the state and how we can regain control. For this conversation, I'm happy to welcome Fabian Stefani, who is non-resident fellow at Bruegel and part of the Future of Work and Inclusive Growth project, and Vili Ledon-Virta, who is Professor of Economic Sociology and Digital Social Research at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. Vili, Fabian, welcome to The Sound of Economics.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
And thanks for joining today. And to start with, I will do something a little bit unusual for The Sound of Economics, which is to read an excerpt from your book, Vili, Cloud Empires. So let me get the passage of the book that I want to read. The internet was supposed to change the structure of society. It was supposed to get rid of gatekeepers and middlemen. It was supposed to empower individuals and communities, create a level playing field, and give everyone access to the same information. It was supposed to obsolete centralized authorities that set up artificial boundaries and compiled dossiers on us. It was supposed to be governed by ethics instead of systems erected to impose order. It was supposed to topple autocrats and promote individual liberty over top-down control. This is what internet visionaries and technologists promised to us, but they delivered something very different. They created some of the most powerful gatekeepers in history. They carved up the internet into walled domains and registered us into databases. Instead of making state authority obsolete, they revealed it. Why did they do this? What does it mean for societies and economies? And what is to be done about it? So, I think, Vili, you couldn't frame better what we want to discuss today. And to kick off, I would really start our conversation with the first question that you ask in your book, which is why this happened. Why did Silicon Valley technologists end up recreating in digital form the very institutions that they were trying to obsolete?
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. So think about it from a historical perspective. Trade and markets used to be underpinned by communities and networks, but it was very small scale trade. Historically, as economies grow and markets extend geographically, and people start to trade with strangers that they don't know, that activity is always underpinned by some sort of authority, state authority, or otherwise, some kind of a central party who can enforce contracts and stop the market from failing in all the different ways that we know that markets like to fail. So in the same way on the internet, the early internet communities, 80s and 90s, when they did business with each other, they were online labor markets already in the late 80s and the early 90s. And when they bought and sold goods and labor, the contracts were not enforced by some authority. They were certainly not enforced by state and courts. But instead, it was all based on people knowing each other and on your personal reputation. And if you don't fulfill your promises, you'll be ostracized by the community. And during this era, we have the rise of this sort of a myth or legend of the self-organizing digital economy, right? But then in the early mid-90s, when the internet boom really started and we had suddenly hundreds of millions of people joining the internet, this informal order broke down because it was based on people knowing each other and communities being stable and quite closed. And instead, consumers found safety inside the walled gardens of platforms like eBay and Amazon, which were both founded in 95. And merchants also enjoyed the opportunities that these platforms provided, which, yes, they acted like top-down authorities. They policed conduct and set rules. But precisely because they did so, the economy was able to thrive and grow massively into unprecedented size. And in this way, the internet economy, its institutional structure, sort of recapitulated the past 3,000 years of economic history just in 30 years. And you could almost, coming back to your original question, well, why did this happen? So why didn't this informal community and network-based order prevail? Why was it replaced by top-down authority, just like state used to do before? Well, you can flip the question around and ask, why wouldn't it? Why would internet be any different from any other period in history?
Well, maybe I want to ask Fabian what he thinks about it, but what you say just makes me react, because I've recently finished to read The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, and actually their main thesis is that there is nothing natural or automatic about the way we depict evolutionary history of going from a state of small-scale trade or communities to a big-scale state like system. And this is very much challenged, I would say, at the intellectual level, but also with the proofs that actually this way we've been looking at the past of saying, there were like small communities and small trade, but actually thousands of years ago, we have proofs that there was already like very, very big global trade and so on, but there were structures which were completely different. So, if I might push back and challenge you, I would say that, the internet of the beginning was different and it became what it became. But there might have been political choices and human choices about making it the way it became. There is nothing automatic or like natural in this evolution, right?
No. So I would certainly agree that there's nothing automatic about it. But I would push back against Graeber's interpretation a little bit. There are other economic historians like Sheila Ogilvy, who has very much taken on this idea that started to critically analyze this idea that, for instance, in the Middle Ages, we had this large-scale international trade, which was underpinned only by lex mercatore, by private law maintained by the merchant networks themselves, and there was no state authority needed, and it was completely possible to have a large-scale international economy without top-down authority. And she very much shows through careful reinterpretation of the evidence this is not the case, that obviously merchants' personal reputations mattered, but in the end, when it came to enforcement, ultimately they had to rely on feudal lords and princes to actually enforce the laws. Now, usually it didn't have to go so far because people knew that, if I don't comply, there will be a top-down authority that will enforce the contract with me. So I would say that the history is undetermined still, in the sense that there is this debate going on as to how exactly things played out in history. And I would say that the picture that I just presented, which was a progression from trade underpinned by informal networks and communities into large-scale market-based trade, it's a stylized history. And it has played out in different ways and many times over throughout history. But I think as a history of Europe, for instance, it's quite accurate today, in the sense that we have very large-scale markets in Europe today, which are very explicitly underpinned by state authority, and they would not be possible without that state authority. And so here where we get to the point about, okay, what are the options? Because as we both agreed, there's nothing automatic about this. And so if we do have both in the sort of offline economy, although I don't like to draw a strong distinction, but if we allow for the purposes of this discussion to draw a distinction between the digital economy and the offline economy, we have in the offline economy alternative modes of economic organization, right? We have communes, we have cooperatives, we have anarchist prefigurative economies. And also in the online economy, we have people who never gave up on those original alternative, informal, network-based, non-authority-based forms of markets. Yeah. But what do all these have in common? They are small in scale. There are very good theoretical reasons in social science theory, as well as very good empirical evidence for the idea that this informal order doesn't scale. Yeah. Now, you can use technology, you can use innovation to push those boundaries and make it scale a little bit more. But ultimately, if you're going to have millions of people who don't know each other trading, we haven't yet figured out how to do that without having some kind of an authority that can police.
So, sorry to interrupt. So basically, your reply to the question why we got there is just a matter of scale, or is there something more than just the scale?
It's essentially, there's more nuance to it and there's more detail to it, but there's essentially, scale is at the essence of it. So it's not that we don't in parallel have other orders as well. They're just very small. So our mainstream economy runs on a top-down authority-based state-like order. And as the internet economy grew, it replicated those same structures necessarily.
Fabian, do you agree with that interpretation?
So I have two hats on here, actually. When I read this book, of course, I greatly enjoyed reading Cloud Empires, and it resonated with me as a researcher, as a colleague, so who's also dealing with online labor markets or digital platforms in general, but also as a curious, scientifically curious reader. And as the latter, I very much also thought about the question that we've been discussing here, which is, if I may simplify it, does history repeat itself to a certain extent? And I'm not so sure if it does, but Willi does a great job in making you at least believe that it does, because there are so many pictures that come to your mind. I'm speaking as this curious scientific reader now. Of course, empires, how empires emerged, why they emerged, why there might have been an economic necessity for them to emerge. And I absolutely believe that there was an economic necessity for great empires to emerge. And also, interestingly, there were often natural tipping points where they dissolved at some point without a lot of, forceful intervention from the outside. Maybe just one single event, but the the reason why they broke down was an inherent flaw, which also had to do something with scale to some extent. They became too large to manage, probably. So in a nutshell, this resonates very well with me. So I do believe in the idea that history repeats itself. But on the other hand, thinking about it as as a colleague, as a scientist who also studies this field, is that there are distinct differences to the past. So it's not that the cloud empires described here by Willy, this Silicon Valley tech companies, are really like Standard Oil or like the Roman Empire, because there are also some different dynamics to them, some different market mechanism that couldn't exist back then. When you think about the value of data, the economics of data. So why, for example, a company like Amazon is becoming so powerful is also because they are very good in an algorithmic usage and reusage and reapplication of customer data. And that's, of course, something that's absolutely alien to previous empires for obvious reasons. So one part makes me definitely think, history does repeat itself to a certain extent, but another part, of course, says there's something really new to these new empires.
Look, one way of thinking about this is, because you're wondering where's the politics? Because if we're presenting this very sort of evolutionary view of economy, where it's a certain laws just sort of force things into the shape they are, and there's no room for humans to make any choices, I don't stand for that.
Where I was coming from with my question is whether we can consider political choice and agency, and basically the fact that we need to include this history that is depicted over there, and parallelism are extremely interesting. And I think this is a very original part and a great part of what you've been saying so far, but that we shouldn't forget the fact that there is human agency, that we can make choices, and the economic system that we are in is not inevitable, even though we are in the situation, as Jameson or Mark Fisher or Zizek would say, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So that's something that we need to clear.
Yes. But here's my key point, which is we do have that agency, but agency operates within structure.
Yeah.
So what the early internet visionaries have in common with sort of anarchist utopians, for instance, is that they allow themselves to imagine so different alternative social orders without any constraints. And I'm saying, but I'm sorry, there are constraints that come from social, economic, and political forces. That the early programmers, they thought, whatever social order we can imagine, we can program it. They thought, in a sense, that they were omnipotent, that they could bring into being any form of social order they could imagine. And my point is that over time, they discovered, this doesn't work, this breaks. Well, we have to implement a little fix here. And then another way in which their imagined scenario breaks, and they implement a little fix. And over time, over 30 years, they ended up right where they began from, which is in the institutions of the state, essentially top-down authority. And this is not because there wasn't any choice, but because what they were trying to achieve was actually the same thing state is trying to achieve, which is large-scale impersonal market exchange. Now, if that's what you want to do, then the institutional solutions will be very similar. But we do have choice in saying, actually, we don't want large-scale market exchange. We want a completely alternative form of economy. But that's a different discussion.
What you just said brings me to the second part of our conversation, which is the fact that whatever has been designed since the beginning of the internet, then it has been designed within our own societies and our own economies. So the question then is, what has been the impact of all this in our economies and societies at large, right?
Yes. Well, very briefly, obviously, one big impact has been that we now have these transnational digital markets underpinned by largely US giant tech companies. And one aspect of that is that we have a lot of new business. So I'm from Finland originally, from Helsinki, and we now have a big app industry there. A lot of people working in developing apps and selling them globally. And they are able to do that thanks to these new marketplaces created by Apple and Google. So there's an economic and sort of social impact in terms of creating new business and opening up opportunities for small businesses to address markets beyond their local geographical area. But then the flip side, obviously, is these markets are now underpinned not by state authority, but by these tech companies, the cloud empires. And they set the rules, and they don't always set the rules to their users' advantage.
Yeah.
And still on the issue of the impact, Fabian, as we are interested also on the impact of all this into the labor markets, and especially for the Bruegel project on future work and inclusive growth, perhaps you can draw some reflections on what Willi just told us, specifically on jobs.
Yeah, so interestingly, so there's one chapter in Cloud Empires where Willi talks about online labor markets, for example. These are these marketplaces where buyers and sellers can exchange services around the world. So you could, you're looking for a graphic designer for, I don't know, starting a company, and you could find that person, a talented graphic designer. Technically speaking, from all around the world. We know from our research that for various reasons it's not that limitless, but it's possible. It's become a global marketplace for services, for digitally deliverable services, and that's also part of the investigations in the Future of Work and Inclusive Growth project. Circulates around these markets or investigates these markets, and the book made me think of, or contrasting to, from my interpretation, the roles between what government agencies, what governments could do to bolster, support, or develop labor markets, and what these tech giants do. And from my very, sketching this in a relatively simplified way, what governments do would essentially be two things on labor markets. They would cushion, they would support people that are in need. Maybe somebody lost a job, in a typical social market economy. They would offer social protection and social security. And on the other hand, they would also probably regulate these markets and implement institutions that allow people to grow, to learn new skills, to develop new ideas, to find a new job. And when looking at these online labor markets, which are not surprisingly governed by big tech companies as well, by big platforms, what we are starting to realize over the last years is that they've probably been doing a good job for those that are in a position of power, have marketable skills, for example. They can really tap into global demand on these markets from all around the world, and sometimes also into demand in projects that are paid much better than their local buyers of work, than their local companies, the local wage levels would allow. But unfortunately, they're not doing a great job with the other promise, of social protection. When it comes to questions, what do these freelancers, these independent workers, if they are really independent, what kind of social security do they gain? If they continuously work for the same client, why aren't they employed with this client? Why are they still considered to be freelancers? So it's tricky with that regard, because probably the tech companies might be doing, if I may say this, maybe even a better job on this, this encouraging or empowering side, but they're definitely doing a worse job on the other end. So that's really difficult.
And perhaps on this thing about doing the job a bit worse, a bit is maybe just an euphemism for certain circumstances. We've been seeing the use of terminology comparing this to a new feudalism or a techno-digital feudalism. For example, Mariana Mazzucato has been using that term, referring to the fact that the digital platform companies have acquired a market position, allowing them to extract massive rents from consumers, but also from workers. and that's something that you were mentioning, Fabian. And Willi, you discuss a lot about the role of the state and the role of the big platforms, and you say that some of the rules we try to use to tame the platforms are not adequate, not because they are too old, but because they are too modern. So what if instead of drawing precedents from how our grandparents dealt with capitalists, we ought to be drawing inspiration from how our ancestors dealt with aristocrats?
Yes, exactly. So if you think, how did we get out of feudalism originally? If we're now living in techno-feudalism, how did we get out of the original feudalism? Isn't that what we should be asking, right? Not how do we deal with oil monopolists? No, that's 500 years later. And if we look, how did we get out of feudalism? Well, one, again, this is kind of stylized history, but one important factor was this rise of the middle class, the burghers, the peasants in the bottom class of the feudal society were too weak to resist the feudal lord's power. But the feudal lords created marketplaces to foster the economies and provide tax income and supply of goods to their towns. And those markets then allowed some people to grow wealthier. They became wealthy merchants. They became artisans. And as they grew in wealth and as they grew in social networks and cultural capital and learning, they began to organize amongst each other, and they began to push back against the feudal lord's power. They started to demand a say in how the market towns in which they worked were governed. And gradually, through all sorts of means, from collective action, campaigning, bribery, threats, mercenaries, they gradually won for themselves a greater and greater control over the institutions under which they operated. And we have the emergence of autonomous market towns all over Europe. And those are really the sort of, in many ways, precursors then to modern European democracy. And so in the same way, in the digital economy, where's the middle class in the digital economy now? Well, it's not the gig workers, unfortunately. It's not the delivery workers, the data labelers, the moderators, whose labor is absolutely essential to keeping the digital economy running. But they are, unfortunately, the most deprived, the bottom layer of the platform society. Instead, the middle class, they are the successful app developers, the successful freelance software designers, the successful online merchants on Amazon, eBay, and Etsy, the successful streamers, YouTubers, OnlyFans models, who are actually making money in the platform economy, and they accumulating resources and networks. And we already have, without going into too much detail here, but we already have examples of them starting to organize and them starting to push back against the platform prince's power and saying, hang on, we want to have some kind of a say in how you run this platform, because you can't just decide one day that our business is no longer allowed or that our taxes are now double from what they used to be from yesterday.
Aren't those also the ones that are most easily co-opted by the tech platforms, especially if you speak about small app developers and so on? Because the way the market is designed is that for them it's more profitable after an app has relative good success. For them it's more profitable to get bought by the big platforms rather than push back and trying to keep that, if I may say.
So certainly, we have this issue of killer acquisitions in the platform economy, right? So whenever one of the platform giants sees that one startup is growing large enough to actually threaten the power of the platform itself, then they will simply acquire it and kill it.
Or even strategically, right? You know, when they see there's a technology that we might need in our tech stack, and the startup has it, then they buy it early.
Right, exactly. Stage, so they are able to maneuver, buy technologies, maintain their lead. They have superior knowledge of the marketplace thanks to all the data they gather. So I'm not here talking about somebody from the middle class, because we have that in history as well, right? Somebody from the middle class, some merchant, Medici or something, becomes so rich and so powerful, and that they in fact turn into the new lord, right? That's not what I'm talking about. And then they start fighting against the Medici was fighting against the Forza, and no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the middle class, the non-standout members who are producing some little games or productivity apps, not of sufficient interest for Apple to actually buy out, but that exist in large numbers. And now if they organize, and if they start to negotiate with Apple with one voice, now individually they have zero negotiating power. It's take it or leave it. The App Store rules are what they are. You take them or leave them. But if 3,000 of them join together, like in this one case that I described in Cloud Empires, then suddenly Apple has to take them seriously. And it can't buy out all the 3,000.
Fabian, what do you think about that?
I think this is so the stylized representation of history. It's very catchy, and I would be happy to buy this. There's one caveat that I'm a bit worried, coming from my experience, particularly with online labor markets, and to a certain extent, what you're describing is, well, I don't know if we could describe this as unionization, because it's not really. Because this is more like the speak of the.
It's more like guilds, no? It's more the concept of a guild.
A guild. Yes. That's a very. Thank you. That's a very good point. Because otherwise, we would still be fighting against Rockefeller, and that's not the opponent that we're looking at here, but rather the monarch. Is of course, how do you feel that you belong to the same group? You know, how strong is the feeling among the members that the person sitting opposite to me, supposedly to fight with me, is like me? Yeah. And for some of the groups that you described, I think there is much more of this kind of guild building lubricant around, but for others, I'm worried that it's not. So if I think about online labor markets, for example, these tasks are often so, the projects, the work that these people are doing are so diverse in both complexity, but also, the domain that they're working in, that it's probably difficult for these folks to feel united to a certain extent, and then unite and work together on this one goal.
Certainly, that's different from a guild of burghers in a city where they all live in the same city and they see each other in the marketplace on a daily basis, and they dine together and whatnot. Whereas in the platform economy, you have, if we continue the example of app developers, they live all over the world. There's some in San Francisco, some in Helsinki, some in Manila. They have vastly different life situations and so on and so on. So it's definitely much harder for them to see each other as part of the same class, right? But I have a paper with Alex Wood titled "Structured Antagonism," where we examine this issue empirically in the case of online freelancing marketplaces. And what we find is that, in fact, what is starting to create and produce that shared identity between these vastly different people is the fact that what they share, what they have in common, are these certain antagonistic encounters with the platform, right? For instance, when the platform doubles the fees, all platform burgers are now in the same boat.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a common cause that they all gripe about.
Yeah, yeah.
They get in the online forum and they all gripe about it.
Sure.
Right. So suddenly they start to see each other as having being a class in itself,
Yeah.
and perhaps a class for itself as well. And I think that this is something that I think is very important to study empirically now, because I believe it's happening to some extent across platforms. We just had Etsy sellers, right? 20,000 Etsy
Yeah.
sellers go on strike
Yeah,
in
yeah.
April this year, right? And this would have been, I think, unthinkable maybe 5 years ago, when it was the discourse and the public awareness was still much more like internet creates these unbounded opportunities and you are free to do business, right? And now a lot of people who are making a living, millions of people making a living online, and they are starting to notice that actually, no, like any morning I wake up, there might be an email in my inbox from the platform company saying, we made some slight adjustments to our policies, and actually what you're doing, how you make your living is no longer allowed, right?
Yeah.
And they live in fear of that email, and they're starting to realize that, right? And so I think that there's a change happening in awareness.
Yeah.
The apparent randomness of the Lord who is changing laws or changing the rules of the game at his own interest and at his own pace. Yes, absolutely. We are unfortunately going towards the end of the episode, but I don't want to leave without a final question because you compare digital platforms with states, and I wonder, isn't that something that could be misleading or even dangerous in terms of legitimizing the kind of power you're trying to denounce?
Yes. So if I go around saying platforms are like states, that could be dangerous, because now then people get used to the idea that, well, then their rule is legitimate since they are like states.
Should
right?
Google have a Secretary of State or a seat at the United Nations? Or
Right. But my response to that is, well, if comparing platforms to states helps to legitimize the idea that they're powerful, surely it should then also help to legitimize another idea that we naturally associate with states, which is that states should be ruled by their people.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a great point to end this conversation, I would say, unless, Fabian, you want to add a final word on that.
So, the one trick question that I had prepared actually was around this, because really the book says like how the state can regain control. And I was thinking, like, is it really the state or is it the people that should regain control?
Yeah.
And
if you look at the title, it's how we can regain control.
Exactly.
We the people, not the state.
It's us. So there's nothing more to add to that, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, there would be much more to add because, of course, this kind of conversation are very interesting. And, of course, we will keep continuing to discuss about the effect of technology over the job market, specifically on our future work and inclusive growth in Europe, but also in general on our societies. And the Sound of Economics will keep following the project, and there will be more episodes dedicated to the theme to come. So I just would like to remind everyone that you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot, Willi and Fabian, and all our listeners for joining the Sound of Economics.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
a lot. Bye.
Until next time, bye-bye.